Welcome to Channel 24. We've had a week full of unexpected news. A leaked call showed Donald Trump's main negotiator giving advice to a Kremlin official on how to present Russia's ideas for a peace plan. Many people in the US and Europe are now asking serious questions about this process. To help us understand what this all means and what comes next, Kurt Volker, former US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, is with me in the studio right now. Mr. Volker, it's my pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
So let's start with the most shocking story of the week, I would say, of this week at least. In Washington right now, how are serious people looking at the fact that Steve Whitkoff was advising a Kremlin aide on how to, sell the Ukraine peace plan to Donald Trump? Does this raise real concerns about conflicts of interest and about who this plan was truly written for?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really shocking. And people in Washington have reacted against that very sharply. What you see there is not only that he was coaching the Russians how to speak to President Trump. I imagine there's a lot of coaching that goes on around the world telling people how to speak to President Trump. But the fact that he was viewing Russia as a partner, Russia, which has attacked Ukraine, has killed civilians, targeted civilians, abducted children, and so forth, and viewing Russia as a partner and Ukraine as something of an object to be carved up. That is what I think people are really reacting very negatively to. Now, that being said, it has been, as you said, a roller coaster of a week, where we had the original plan, which Dmitriev and Whitkoff put together, which was incredibly one-sided and would have been terrible for Ukraine. Thanks to negotiations with Marco Rubio and Andriy Yermak and European leaders in Geneva, has been turned into a much more reasonable plan, which is being discussed with the Russians in the coming days. Of course, Russia will reject that and demand the original. But this basically puts us right back where we started from. The US, Ukraine, and Europe largely in alignment about a ceasefire and an end to the war, and Russia wanting to continue the war, and therefore all of us needing to put more pressure on Russia. So as I said, it's been a roller coaster of a week, but I think we are back where we began.
Right. Yeah, the news are changing so fast, to be honest. And from your point of view, is it already a mistake that so many leaders treat this plan as a serious basis for talks when many points clearly look like they were written in Moscow and run through Google Translate? At what point should responsible politicians say this document is too compromised to be the foundation of peace?
Yeah, I think that should have happened, to be honest. I think we should have just said from the beginning, on the American side, that this is unacceptable. Unfortunately, Whitkoff did not do that. President Trump did not do that, but instead just put the plan out there to discuss. That meant that it had to be corrected, even though we should have just dropped it from the beginning. We don't know what the current plan looks like, the so-called 19 points. That is something that has been kept very close hold. It's hard to really comment when we haven't seen what remains of that.
Yeah, okay, so to clarify on that one, how can the US and Europe now get out of this situation without making Ukraine look like the side that is, blocking peace simply because Kyiv refuses territorial losses, a smaller army, and giving up NATO membership? What would a more honest path toward look like? How we can get out of this?
Yeah, well, I think, as I said, I think we are back where we started, at least I hope we are. And that means that the steps should be put some more pressure on Russia to get Putin to agree to a ceasefire now, in place, without changing of territory, without recognition of Russia having seized Ukrainian territory, just a ceasefire. And the steps that would do that would include Europe finally going ahead and seizing the frozen Russian assets and using them to support Ukraine. It would involve helping Ukraine further with air defense and long-range munitions, and it would involve secondary sanctions to go along with the primary sanctions on Russia's oil and gas trade. Those three things, I think, are very important and should be done as soon as possible.
Yes, Mr. Volker, but have you heard that Belgian Prime Minister just this morning said that he's against that, giving this frozen Russian assets to Ukraine, at least right now, because it may affect the negotiating process. So I think everything is on pause.
Yeah. Right, I saw that, and that is a foolish argument in my view,
Yes,
because
absolutely.
it would assist the negotiating process. It would not disrupt it, it would assist it. But that being said, he makes one good point, which I think European leaders need to take seriously, which is that if there are lawsuits in the future and Belgium were to lose to a Russian lawsuit, Belgium should not be responsible alone for dealing with the seized 100 billion euros or 140 billion euros in assets. It should be a collective EU responsibility. That one point makes sense, and the EU leaders ought to provide that kind of guarantee to Belgium. But the rest of it are specious arguments, in my view, and should be dispensed with quickly, and the EU should be moving on these assets as quickly as possible.
And you know what's interesting? After the leak of the call that we discussed previously with the Kremlin, Trump's chief negotiator is under fire in Washington, as you said, and yet the president is defending him. Why?
Well, it's his special envoy, so of course he will defend him in a public way. And President Trump doesn't really care about the contents of the peace plan, in my view. He just wants peace. And so he's happy for any document to be out there. He's happy for Whitkoff to be trying to create a process and stir up both sides. And then whatever the negotiators agree to between Russia, Ukraine, Europe, etc., Trump will be fine with whatever that is, as long as it stops the fighting. So I think those are the reasons that are in his mind. He'd rather have a process. He'd rather have negotiations than none at all. It's unfortunate because I think this could have been handled very, very differently.
But I'm just reading news that a lot of people in the Congress, and it was previously, saying that they want Whitkoff's removal, and some of them compared his behavior to that of a paid Kremlin agent. I don't know, I was thinking how it's going to, affect tensions between the US and Russia in all this talk process.
Well, I don't think it's going to have an impact. I think that President Trump still wants to do a deal. He wants to do a deal with Putin. And I think Putin knows that as well. So I think we're not going to see a major change there. And while you're absolutely right, this is what some members of Congress are calling for, I don't see Trump agreeing to that or changing what he's doing.
Yes. And one more, are we risking losing U.S. support altogether? You said before, because I was reading that you said before it would be a shameful step for President Trump, but still, how real is this danger?
Yeah, I don't think it is that great a danger. Obviously, we have to think about it and we have to talk about it. But I think President Trump knows that if he cut off U.S. support for Ukraine completely, even if it's being paid for by our European allies, if he just cut it off, the failure of Ukraine in the future, if Ukraine were to fail, would be on his shoulders. And it would be an even worse catastrophe for his presidency than Afghanistan was for President Biden. So I think it's very unlikely that he would really do that. And even what he said just the other day when we had to pull back the Whitkoff plan, agree to something else with Rubio, send these negotiators out again. He was asked if there's a deadline. And he said, no, there's no deadline. He's just going to keep pushing for this until they get a peace agreement. And I think that's really where he is. He's going to keep going.
Yeah, because in the question of the American support, lots of Ukrainians, they are worried about intelligence support. It has no equal in Europe, and you know that. And if it stops Russia, we'll have more opportunities to kill Ukrainians, which they obviously want to. How can Ukraine and Europe, avoid that scenario?
Well, I think, first off, the U.S. Should continue to provide that kind of support, the intelligence support and other related support. I don't see that being at risk. And what Europe and Ukraine should do is work as quickly as possible to develop redundant capability, additional capability in intelligence through space-based systems. It will take a lot of time and a lot of money. Europe is already beginning to invest in that, but there's no reason to wait or to remain dependent on the U.S. Europe should be creating a redundant system anyway.
Yeah, you're right. And, Bloomberg is saying, Mr. Volker, that Russia is losing thousands of soldiers every week, suffering inflation and extremely high interest rates. Why isn't the West using, I think it's not using, the moment of Russian weakness to increase pressure instead of pushing compromises?
Right. I completely agree with you. It is so obvious that that is what we should be doing. As you say, and as Bloomberg has said, the Russian economy is in a tough position. Interest rates, inflation, growth, labor shortages, shortages of components, and so forth. We should be putting pressure on exactly those points. And that's what these secondary sanctions would do by dissuading those who are willing now to do trade with Russia in oil and gas, to have them not do that because they would face sanctions themselves for doing so. I think that would contribute to drying up the funds available to the Kremlin for continuing the war. So it is, again, like the seizure of the frozen assets, this is an urgent step that we should be taking. And we have been very slow and reluctant to do so.
I hope that tendency will change eventually. So thank you so much, Mr. Volker, for your time. Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, was with me in the studio. Thank you.